A Navy SEAL lay unconscious in a frozen pasture, with an old horse rearing above him in the pale Minnesota dawn. The FBI agent raised her weapon, certain she had arrived one breath too late. Then her German shepherd froze at a torn bridle near the soldier's hand. Inside it was something no one was meant to find. If you believe God still sends signs through his creatures, leave amen. The morning road into Harbor Wren, Minnesota, looked too clean to be hiding anything. Sunlight spilled over the northern hills in long, pale ribbons, touching the snowbanks beside the highway and turning the frozen edges of Lake Superior into sheets of blue silver. Pine trees stood in patient rows along the road, their branches dusted white, their shadows falling across quiet farm lanes and red barns that seemed painted for postcards. To anyone passing through, Harbor Wren looked like a town where trouble would feel embarrassed to enter. But Special Agent Evelyn Merrow had learned long ago that evil did not always arrive wearing a dark coat. Sometimes it wore polished shoes, smiled at church suppers, and signed contracts with careful handwriting. Eve was 30 years old, tall and slim, with fair skin touched by the cold and gray-green eyes that rarely missed a detail. Her dark brown hair was pulled into a low bun beneath a Navy FBI field jacket, and her face carried the calm of someone who had survived being doubted by people she once trusted. Years earlier in Chicago, Eve had spoken against investigators who used cruel and dishonest methods to force confessions from frightened men. She had done the right thing, and the right thing had cost her friends, promotions, and the comfortable lie that every badge carried honor. Since then, she had stopped expecting applause. She only expected the truth to be difficult. Beside her in the passenger seat sat Ash, her 5-year-old German shepherd K9, broad-chested and powerful, with a sable coat marked by a dark saddle and golden-brown highlights. His ears stood sharp as twin sentries, and his amber eyes watched the passing fields with the solemn intelligence of an old soul. Ash was trained to find hidden evidence, trace human scent, detect certain chemicals, and notice what human pride often overlooked. But to Eve, he was more than training. He was the quiet compass that pointed toward things the world had tried to bury. Their case had begun as numbers on a screen. Northgate Renewal Facility, a private detention and rehabilitation center, had built its reputation on soft words: dignity, second chances, community healing. It claimed to help adults who had stumbled, homeless veterans, poor workers buried under court fees, people recovering from addiction, lonely men and women without anyone to stand beside them. On paper, Northgate offered skills, structure, and hope. But Eve had seen the figures climb every time the county court sent more people into its program. Beds filled, payments rose, names appeared, transferred, and then faded from public records like footprints under new snow. One name kept returning in the invoices: Bright Hollow Farm, transportation fees, animal care fees, recovery labor fees, rural security services. Yet the owner, Mabel Thorne, had filed paperwork months earlier ending all work with Northgate. The contradiction was small, but Eve respected small contradictions. They were like loose threads on an expensive coat. Pull one long enough, and the whole garment could come apart. Before heading to Bright Hollow, Eve stopped at a roadside diner where Sheriff Graham Voss had asked to meet. Voss was in his early 50s, tall and broad through the shoulders, with gray blond hair combed neatly back and a beard trimmed close along a square jaw. His smile was warm in the practiced way of men who shook many hands, but his pale eyes stayed cold, measuring Eve as if she were an inconvenience with a badge. He wore his tan sheriff's jacket like a family inheritance, not a public duty. Harbor Wren is a peaceful town, Agent Merrow, Voss said, stirring coffee he did not drink. We take care of our own. No need to dig up old soil because of a few accounting questions. Eve looked through the diner window at the lake shining beyond the road. Old soil is where roots live, Sheriff. His smile tightened. Sometimes it is where people bury things better left alone. Ash, lying at Eve's feet, lifted his head at that. Not a growl, not a bark, just a slow, silent stare. Eve felt it like a hand on her shoulder. Bright Hollow Farm sat 6 miles north of town, where the road curved through birch trees and opened into a bright valley. White fences framed fields still patched with snow. A red-brown horse barn leaned in the sunlight with the tired dignity of something repaired 100 times and loved each time. Wind chimes made from old horseshoes sang softly near the porch. Near the feed shed, a gray goat with one bent horn had his head buried in a sack of oats, chewing with the shameless confidence of a politician caught beside an open safe. "That is Pickles," Mabel Thorne said from the porch. "He believes every crime can be forgiven if committed before breakfast." Mabel was 68, small but sturdy, with silver hair twisted into a low bun and a weathered face lined by work, grief, and humor. Her eyes were blue and direct, the eyes of a woman who had buried illusions but not kindness. She wore a thick brown barn coat, wool gloves, and boots scarred by years of frozen mud. People in town called her the gatekeeper, Eve had been told, because Bright Hollow had become a refuge for retired horses, aging service dogs, lost veterans, and grown people who needed one safe place where no one asked them to prove they were worth saving. Mabel's voice was blunt, but not unkind. She explained that Bright Hollow had once accepted a few adults from Northgate for farm work, believing the program might help people rebuild their lives. "Then I saw how tired they were," she said. "Not tired from honest work, tired from being owned by paperwork. I ended the agreement." Her mouth hardened. "After that, inspectors started visiting, my permits got delayed, and invoices appeared with my farm's name on them like ghosts wearing my boots." A sharp clatter split the morning, the sound of iron striking frozen wood, once, twice, then a long, ragged cry rolled from behind the barn. The horseshoe chimes went still. Pickles pulled his head from the oat sack with a guilty beard of grain, and Ash rose so fast his leash snapped tight in Eve's hand. Mabel's face changed. That was Bishop? Bishop was Mabel's oldest horse, a chestnut gelding with a graying muzzle, one slightly folded ear, and a temperament sharp enough to make grown men reconsider their life choices. He tolerated Mabel, ignored most visitors, and treated veterinarians as suspicious traveling salesmen. But he did not panic in daylight. Not like that. Ash moved first, not with wild alarm, but with purpose. His nose lifted into the wind blowing from the back pasture. Eve saw his body tighten. He had found something layered in the cold air, frozen mud, old leather, veterinary sedative, and the faint human scent of fear and exhaustion. Eve unclipped the safety strap on her sidearm but kept her hand low. "Mabel, stay behind me." "I have owned horses longer than you have owned that jacket," Mabel said, but she followed. They ran past the barn, through a gate hanging crooked on its hinges, and into the rear pasture. The sunlight there was brighter, almost beautiful, and that made the scene ahead feel wrong. Bishop reared near the fence line, his front legs cutting the air, his chestnut coat shining with sweat despite the cold. Beneath him, or so it first appeared, a man in dark tactical clothing lay motionless on the frozen mud. For one breath, Eve thought the horse was attacking him. Then Ash did something strange. He did not lunge at Bishop. He circled low, ears back, whining softly as if soothing a frightened guardian. Bishop came down hard, placing himself not over the man, but between him and the black line of trees beyond the pasture. Eve saw fresh boot prints there. 3 sets. Recent. Retreating. The man was in his 30s, rugged and broad-shouldered, with short brown hair, a rough beard, and a face drained pale by cold and exhaustion. A torn patch on his tactical jacket showed the name Renner. His breathing was faint, but present. Near his hand lay an old leather bridle, cracked with age. Ash stepped forward and placed one paw gently on it. Eve knelt, her pulse steady, but her throat tight. Inside a hidden slit in the leather, something small and waterproof caught the morning light. The horse had not been trying to take the soldier's life. He had been keeping him alive until the one person who knew how to listen to animals arrived. Cole Renner was still breathing, but only barely. Eve Merrow felt the weak rise beneath his tactical vest with 2 fingers pressed against his collar, and for one cold second the whole pasture seemed to hold its breath with him. The morning sun had climbed higher over Bright Hollow, bright enough to make the snow glitter along the fence rails, yet there was no warmth in the light. There was only the old chestnut horse standing guard, the German shepherd lying close, and the fallen man whose face looked pale beneath the mud and frost. "Stay with me, Renner," Eve said, her voice steady because panic had never saved anyone. Her hands moved with practiced care. She checked his airway, his pulse, the stiffness in his limbs, the faint trembling under his skin. Cole was a man in his mid-30s, broad-shouldered and powerfully built, with short brown hair, a rough beard, and the worn face of someone who had learned to sleep lightly. Even unconscious, there was a kind of discipline in him, as if some hidden part of his body still knew how to endure. Ash lowered himself against Cole's side, pressing his warm sable body close. The 5-year-old German shepherd did not crowd the man's face or paw at him. He simply settled with solemn purpose, amber eyes fixed on the tree line, ears flicking at every sound. Ash had guarded evidence before. He had guarded victims. But this was different. He behaved as if Cole belonged to the same invisible order of service that Ash understood without words. "Should I call Graham?" Mabel asked, standing a few feet back with both gloved hands gripping the fence. Her silver hair had come loose from its bun, and the wind pulled small strands across her weathered face. The old woman looked shaken, but not helpless. Mabel Thorne had the look of a person who had seen storms take roofs, illness take neighbors, and time take nearly everything except stubbornness. "Not first," Eve said. Mabel's eyes narrowed. "You think Voss is mixed in this?" "I think somebody wanted this to look like your horse did it." Eve looked at Bishop. The old gelding stood between Cole and the dark pines beyond the pasture, sides heaving, one ear folded, the other turned toward the woods. "And your horse has been arguing with that lie all morning." Eve called an independent EMS dispatch from the next county and then contacted the regional FBI office in Minneapolis through an encrypted line. Only after that did she send a minimal notification to local law enforcement. "Injured man, medical response in progress, federal agent on scene." She left out the bridle. She left out the hidden object. She left out the boot tracks in the mud. The pasture began to speak in small signs. 2 drag marks ran from the far fence toward the place where Cole lay. 3 sets of boot prints crossed the frozen mud, then broke toward the pines. A truck had backed in near the service gate, its tires leaving wide, aggressive grooves in the half-thawed earth. Near the lower rail, Eve found a broken dart casing, the kind used for veterinary sedatives. She picked it up with a gloved hand and placed it into an evidence bag. Mabel stared at the casing. "That did not come from my vet kit." "No," Eve said, "and the marks on him do not match a horse." Cole had bruising from a hard fall and from being dragged, but there were no hoof-shaped injuries, no pattern that matched Bishop's shoes. Someone had wanted the scene to look simple. A trespasser, an angry horse, an old woman's farm ruined by scandal. But nature had refused to cooperate. Mud remembered, snow recorded. Animals told the truth in a language people tried to call instinct because they were too proud to call it wisdom. Then Bishop struck the ground once with his front hoof. The sound cracked through the pasture like a wooden door slamming in an empty church. Ash lifted his head. Eve froze. From the tree line came a faint metallic click, so small it might have been a branch shifting in the cold, except branches did not hesitate after being heard. Eve turned slowly, one hand near her sidearm. Nothing moved among the pines. But Ash's low rumble told her enough. Someone had been watching, and whoever it was had just learned that Cole Renner was alive. The ambulance arrived 10 minutes later, followed by a square-shouldered paramedic named Nora Vale, a woman in her 40s with dark-cropped hair, brown skin, and the no-nonsense calm of someone who had carried too many strangers back from the edge. She moved quickly, spoke gently, and did not waste questions. With her was Owen Price, a young EMT with sandy hair, nervous hands, and kind eyes that kept darting toward Bishop as if the horse might file a complaint. Nora checked Cole's pupils, temperature, and pulse. He is cold, dehydrated, sedated, and very lucky. Lucky? Owen murmured. Nora glanced at Ash pressed against Cole's side and Bishop still blocking the pasture. Yes, Lucky had 4 legs twice today. They loaded Cole carefully. Ash tried to follow, but Eve gave one soft command, and he stopped, though his body trembled with protest. Before the doors closed, Cole's hand shifted against the blanket, fingers curling as if searching for something that was no longer there. Sheriff Graham Voss arrived just as the ambulance pulled away. His cruiser rolled into the yard too fast for a man who claimed he had only just been notified. Voss stepped out in his tan jacket, gray-blonde hair neat, face arranged into concern. His pale eyes moved over Eve, Mabel, Bishop, and finally the disturbed Mud. "He conscious?" Voss asked. "Not who is he? Not what happened? Not is he alive?" Eve let the question hang long enough for him to feel its weight. "He is being treated." Voss smiled without warmth. "Dangerous animals can make a mess of things. I warned Mabel about keeping that old horse." Mabel's voice turned sharp. "That old horse has better manners than half the men in this county." Pickles, as if summoned to support her testimony, bleated from the feed shed with a mouthful of stolen oats. At the hospital, Cole remained unconscious behind a pale curtain in a quiet emergency room that smelled of antiseptic and coffee left too long on a warmer. Dr. Helen Armitage, a lean woman in her late 50s with copper-gray hair and tired blue eyes, confirmed what Eve already suspected. Cole had signs of a low-dose animal sedative, exposure to cold, dehydration, and physical strain. "He was not simply knocked down by a horse," she said. "Anyone saying that is trying to make the truth smaller." Mabel arrived an hour later carrying the old bridle wrapped in a towel. Bishop had refused to let anyone touch it until Ash sat beside him and Eve spoke softly into the morning air. Only then had the horse lowered his head, as if handing over a sacred burden. Inside the cracked leather seam, Eve found a waterproof micro-SD card no bigger than a fingernail. On the hospital bench, with Ash lying against the door like a silent guard, she opened the files on a secure tablet. The names appeared one by one. Bed count, labor transfer, court fee recovery, animal transport, Northgate overflow. There were maps, invoices, coded payments, and routes connecting Northgate to rural farms across the northern counties. Bright Hollow was there too, but the signature beside Mabel's name was false. Behind the curtain, Cole stirred. Eve stepped in as his eyelids fluttered. His eyes were hazel, glassy with fever and exhaustion, but focused enough to find her badge, then Ash beyond her. "Do not trust Voss," he whispered. Each word seemed to cost him. "Northgate is not recovery. It is a machine that counts people." His eyes closed again. Eve stood in the hallway with the card in her palm. Ash suddenly rose and stared toward the hospital entrance, ears sharp, body still as carved stone. Outside, through the glass doors, a black SUV eased away from the parking lot and disappeared into the white morning. Cole Renner had been saved from the pasture, but the truth he carried had awakened an entire town pretending to sleep. By noon, the hospital room had gone quiet in that strange way hospitals often do, where every beep sounded too loud and every footstep in the hallway seemed to carry news. Cole Renner was awake enough to answer questions, but not enough to pretend he was fine. He sat propped against white pillows, his broad frame swallowed by a thin blanket, his short brown hair still damp from the cold sweat of recovery. The rugged confidence of a Navy SEAL had not left him, but it had been dimmed, like a lantern seen through fog. His hazel eyes moved from Eve to Ash, then back again, as if deciding how much truth his body could afford to give. Eve stood beside the bed with her secure tablet in one hand and the waterproof micro-SD card in the other. Ash lay near the door, sable coat catching the pale winter light, ears angled toward the hallway. He looked still, but Eve knew better. Ash was listening to the building the way some men listen to a confession. "You said Northgate counts people," Eve said softly. "Tell me what that means." Cole swallowed. His voice came rough but steady. Northgate gets paid by occupancy, work contracts, court recovery fees, and transport. Empty beds do not earn. Full beds do. The words were simple. That made them worse. The files from Cole's card confirmed it. Eve had spent the morning matching his data with the financial records she already carried. Northgate Renewal Facility presented itself as a place of second chances, a clean complex with blue brochures, smiling staff, and phrases like dignity through work. But the spreadsheets told a colder story. The more adults Judge Harlan Pike sent into the program, the more money moved through private accounts, consulting companies, and rural service contracts. Some people entered Northgate for unpaid fines, sleeping in restricted areas, missed hearings, minor probation issues, or small public disturbances. Many were lonely, broke, recovering, aging, or carrying old grief from military service. They were the sort of people a town could fail without admitting it had failed anyone at all. Judge Harlan Pike appeared in the files as a man wrapped in respectable language. He was 61, with silver hair combed neatly back, a narrow face, and rimless glasses that made his eyes look thoughtful in newspaper photographs. Eve had seen him speak at public forums online. His voice was rich and careful, the voice of a man who said accountability as if it were a hymn. He often spoke of restoring order and giving troubled adults structure. Yet his court sent people to Northgate at a rate no neighboring county came close to matching. Then there was Elias Creed, Northgate's owner. Creed was in his mid-50s, lean and elegant, with smooth dark hair touched by gray at the temples and a calm smile that never seemed to reach his eyes. He wore wool suits, gave charity speeches, and donated to veterans' dinners. His public image was soft-handed mercy. His paperwork was a harvest machine, labor transfer, animal transport, court fee recovery, rural security. The phrases were dressed cleanly, but underneath them Eve saw people turned into numbers. Voss's name appeared less often. That was almost more troubling. Sheriff Graham Voss did not seem to build the machine. He seemed to clear the road for it. Deleted camera logs, delayed incident reports, transport routes marked county advised, witness complaints closed without review. Voss was not the judge, not the businessman, not the preacher of second chances. He was the locked gate and the friendly warning sign. Cole closed his eyes for a moment, gathering strength. I was looking for Walter Boone. Eve looked up. Who is he? A veteran, 63, Navy mechanic, long time ago. Thin man, gray beard, bad knees, big laugh when he still had one. Cole's mouth tightened. He slept in his truck behind a grocery store during a cold snap, got cited, could not pay the fees. Pike sent him to Northgate for structured work. The record says he was transferred to another recovery site. No one has seen him since. There was pain in Cole's voice, but also guilt. Eve recognized that kind of guilt. It was the burden of people who believed they should have arrived sooner. She had carried her own version from Chicago, from rooms where silence had worn uniforms and called itself loyalty. Back then, she had spoken out against men who hid their methods behind closed doors and old friendships. She had thought truth would crack the wall. Instead, the wall had turned on her first. Now, in Harbor Wren, she could feel the same architecture around her, only larger. Not just a police department, a courthouse, a business, a county budget, a smiling town pretending every clean street meant every conscience was clean. From the hallway came the soft squeak of rubber soles stopping too suddenly. Ash lifted his head before Eve turned. The room paused. Even Cole's breathing seemed to quiet. A shadow crossed the narrow window beside the door, then vanished, leaving only the sterile smell of disinfectant and the feeling that someone had heard more than they meant to. Eve stepped into the hall. A young deputy stood near the vending machine, pretending to study a row of candy bars. He was about 27, tall but not yet comfortable in his height, with sandy brown hair under a county cap and a face too open to hide worry well. His uniform was neat, his boots polished, but his fingers kept tapping against his thigh. His nameplate read Noah Bell. When Eve looked at him, his eyes flicked toward Ash, then away. "Deputy Bell," Eve said. He gave a small nod. "Agent? Were you looking for someone?" "No, ma'am, just checking on the situation." His voice was respectful, but strained, like a board bending under weight. "Sheriff Voss asked for updates." Eve studied him. Noah had the look of a decent man standing too close to a fire he had not started. "Then tell Sheriff Voss the patient is alive." Noah swallowed. For a second, something like relief crossed his face. Then fear chased it away. "Yes, ma'am." He left without another word, but Ash watched him until he disappeared around the corner. Later that afternoon, Eve returned to Bright Hollow with Mabel to collect formal records. The farm looked brighter than the hospital, yet heavier too. Bishop stood in the pasture, his chestnut coat brushed clean, his old folded ear turned toward the drive as Eve arrived. He did not come to the fence. He simply watched, a tired guardian still on duty. Pickles, the gray goat with one bent horn and the moral discipline of a raccoon at a picnic, shoved his head into a storage shed and knocked over a cardboard box. "Pickles," Mabel snapped, "you four-legged tax audit." The box spilled old envelopes across the wooden floor. Eve bent to help, then froze. One envelope bore Northgate's blue seal. Inside was Mabel's cancellation letter, dated months earlier, with a certified receipt attached. It proved Bright Hollow had cut ties long before the latest invoices appeared. Mabel's face hardened. "They used my name after I shut the door." "They used your farm as a mask," Eve said. At dusk, Eve returned to her small room at the Harbor Wren Motor Lodge, a clean, old-fashioned place with pine walls, a humming heater, and curtains printed with faded loons. Ash entered first, swept the room, then allowed Eve inside. She had just set her tablet on the desk when she noticed the envelope under the door. No stamp, no name. Inside was a photograph. Cole's body being dragged near the back pasture of Bright Hollow. 3 dark figures around him. At the bottom, written in block letters, was a warning. "Take your dog out of town before he finds the second gate." Ash placed his muzzle on the photograph, amber eyes fixed on Eve. Somewhere in Harbor Wren, the darkness had spoken, and Ash had heard the challenge. Cole Renner should have been resting, but resting had never been one of his stronger talents. By the next morning, he sat at Mabel Thorne's kitchen table with a blanket over his shoulders, one hand wrapped around a mug of coffee he was not allowed to drink yet. Dr. Armitage had released him under strict conditions. No field work, no driving, no heroics, and absolutely no pretending that a body recently found half frozen in a pasture could behave like it had merely overslept. Cole had nodded like a responsible man, and then immediately asked Eve for the map. Mabel set a bowl of chicken soup in front of him with the authority of a judge handing down a life sentence. "Eat." Cole looked into the bowl with the caution of a man examining an explosive device. "Ma'am, I have survived ocean training, winter survival, and 3 days in a desert with 1 canteen." Mabel, 68 years old and no taller than his shoulder, leaned over the table with her silver hair pinned back and her blue eyes bright as cold fire. "My soup has defeated 2 husbands, 1 blizzard, and a mule named Jeremiah. Do not test it." For the first time since the pasture, Cole almost smiled. Eve caught it and felt something inside her loosen. Not trust yet. Trust was a bridge she crossed slowly now. But the room had warmth in it. The stove ticking, snow sliding from the roof, Pickles outside the window trying to reach a wreath on the porch rail, and Ash stretched beneath the table with his sable body half against Cole's boot, as if the K9 had quietly added the seal to his list of things worth guarding. On the table lay the evidence: printed maps, Northgate invoices, Mabel's cancellation letter, photos of tire tracks, a sealed bag holding the broken veterinary dart, and Cole's recovered micro-SD card. Cole, pale but focused, pointed to a thin line north of Bright Hollow. That trail does not show on public road maps anymore. Old timber route. It connects to Red Alder Yard. Mabel's spoon stopped in midair. That place has been empty for years. Owned by a shell company tied to Elias Creed, Eve said. She stood beside the table in her Navy FBI field jacket, dark hair in a low bun, gray-green eyes moving from the printed map to the window where the bright northern morning shone too peacefully. And someone warned us about a second gate. Ash lifted his head before anyone moved, his ears angled toward the rear of the farm. Eve followed his gaze. Beyond the barn, beyond Bishop's pasture, a narrow line of old fencing disappeared into the birch trees. At its end stood a wooden gate she had not noticed the day before, gray with age and half swallowed by snow-dusted grass. Mabel looked toward it and frowned. That was the north logging gate. Has not been used since my father's time. Ash did not agree. The moment they stepped outside, he moved toward it with a low, focused pull, nose working the air. Bishop stood at the far fence, old chestnut coat shining in the pale sun, folded ear turned toward them. He gave one deep, warning snort. Eve noticed the gate's hinges had fresh oil on them. The lock was not old at all. It was new black steel, bright beneath a smear of mud. "No one from my farm put that there," Mabel said. Eve photographed it, recorded the position, and made the call. She requested an emergency expansion of the warrant through the regional office, citing Cole's assault, the sedative dart, the forged invoices, the Northgate routes, and fresh evidence of unauthorized access on Bright Hollow property. She would not give Voss the satisfaction of claiming she had overstepped. While waiting for clearance, she and Ash stayed on the Bright Hollow side of the fence, observing only what could be seen from Mabel's land. Through the trees, Eve spotted wide tire impressions, recent snowmobile grooves, and the corner of a shipping crate with Northgate's blue logo painted over in dull gray. A sudden gust pushed through the birches, and with it came a sound that did not belong to any farm. A low metal groan, followed by the soft thud of a heavy door closing somewhere deep in the woods. Ash froze. The morning birds went silent. Even Pickles stopped chewing the stolen wreath, as if the whole valley had heard the earth open its mouth. The warrant came through 40 minutes later. By then, Cole had set up in Mabel's kitchen with a secure phone, a laptop, and the stubborn expression of a man unhappy to be useful from a chair. Eve did not let him come. "You can read routes, decode files, and warn me if anything moves," she said. "That is not a suggestion." Cole gave her a dry look. "I was going to offer moral support." "Mabel's soup can do that." Ash led Eve through the north gate and into the birch woods. The path was narrow, old, and beautiful in a haunted way. Sunlight spilled across the snow in broken squares, and the air smelled of pine sap, cold mud, diesel, leather, and something chemical Ash clearly disliked. He moved with silent urgency, large paws steady over frozen ground. Eve trusted him more than she trusted the map. Red Alder Yard appeared beyond a stand of spruce like a forgotten stain on the land. It was an abandoned cattle yard, collapsed fencing, a long, low barn, rusted feeders, and a loading shed with fresh tire marks cutting through the mud. Its loneliness felt staged. Places truly forgotten did not have new padlocks, covered cameras, and fuel cans stacked beside a service door. Eve stayed low, using the barn wall as cover. She documented everything before touching anything. Through a cracked side window, she saw metal shelving lined with boxes of files, a white freezer truck with no visible company markings, and several animal transport crates. A shipping label had been scraped, but enough remained to read Northgate Renewal. On a nearby clipboard were coded names, dates, and phrases that matched Cole's files: labor transfer, court recovery, overflow work detail. Inside the old tack room, Ash reacted sharply. He sniffed beneath a bench, then pressed his paw against a worn canvas coat. Eve lifted it with gloved hands. The name patch was faded, but readable: W. Boone, Walter Boone. The missing veteran Cole had been searching for. The coat smelled of dust, fear, and antiseptic. Not old enough to be forgotten, not fresh enough to be safe. Eve photographed the coat and felt her purpose harden. This was no longer only about proving corruption. Somewhere beneath the language of programs and payments, a living man might still be waiting to be found. Her phone vibrated once. A secure message from Cole, second vehicle approaching from West Service Road. 2 minutes. A second message appeared seconds later from an unknown number. Bell. Camera on Ridge Road ordered off by Voss. Careful. Eve did not breathe for a moment. Deputy Noah Bell had chosen a side, even if only by a few words. She slipped into an empty stall with Ash as 2 men entered the yard. One was stocky, red-faced, wearing a black winter cap and carrying a radio. The other was thinner, with a hawk-like nose and nervous hands. They were not deputies. They moved like hired muscle, with too much confidence and too little discipline. Eve set a tiny camera between the boards and recorded them arguing about Creed wanting the dog collars gone before dark. Dog collars. When they moved into the loading shed, Eve guided Ash toward the rear exit. She had what she needed for now: transport evidence, Walter's coat, Northgate markings, and a direct link to unauthorized movement. She did not need a firefight in an old cattle yard with Cole still weak and backup miles away. Then came chaos wearing horns. Pickles had somehow ridden in the back of Mabel's farm truck and wandered after them down the trail. The gray goat appeared at the edge of the yard, saw a shiny metal feed bin, and charged it with the confidence of a crusader. The bin toppled with a thunderous crash. Both guards spun toward the noise. Eve did not waste the gift. She and Ash slipped through the rear gate, crossed the tree line, and disappeared into the white birches with the camera, photographs, and Walter Boone's name burning in her mind. Back at Bright Hollow, Cole studied the images on Eve's tablet. His face changed when he saw the coat. The hard seal mask cracked just enough to reveal the man beneath it. Walter was there? Maybe still is, Eve said. Cole zoomed in on one map pinned behind the freezer truck. That route matches what I saw before they caught me. Red Alder is a transfer point. Northgate sends people out under work orders. Creed makes money. Pike fills the beds. Voss keeps the road clean. And someone else uses the whole system to move things no one is supposed to see. Ash, who had been resting near Bishop's bridle, suddenly stood. He went to the old leather and nudged it with his muzzle. Eve frowned. They had already found the micro SD card in the seam, but Ash pawed at a thicker section near the bit strap. Cole leaned forward. "There is a second layer," he said quietly. Eve used a small blade to open the inner fold. A damp piece of paper slid out, folded until it was no bigger than a postage stamp. 3 words had been written in a shaky hand. Walter alive. Northgate Lower Wing. Cole had not only brought back evidence, he had brought back a name still waiting to be saved. By the time Eve Merrow sent the first full evidence packet to the regional FBI office, Harbor Wren had already begun whispering against her. It started politely, as cowardice often did. A diner waitress stopped meeting her eyes. A clerk at the courthouse told her the records room was temporarily unavailable while standing in front of the unlocked door. At the gas station, 2 men in work jackets turned their backs when Ash stepped through the entrance beside her. The town still looked beautiful beneath the northern sun, with Lake Superior shining like a silver shield beyond the roofs, but Eve could feel the air changing. Peaceful places did not always protect truth. Sometimes they protected comfort. Sheriff Graham Voss made his move before noon. A local radio host read an anonymous statement about Eve's past in Chicago, calling her a federal agent with a history of turning against her own. By evening, a county message board had filled with ugly little judgments dressed as concern. People said she had come to Harbor Wren to punish local officers because she disliked authority. Others said she had destroyed good men's careers before and would do it again for attention. Eve sat in Mabel's kitchen, listening to the old farmhouse creak around her, and felt the old wound open with quiet precision. It was not the insults that hurt most. It was how familiar they sounded. Ash lay at her feet, his sable coat warm against her boot, his amber eyes fixed on her face. He knew sadness differently than people did. He did not try to explain it away. He simply stayed. Cole Renner sat across from her at the table, still pale from his ordeal, one arm resting carefully against his ribs. His short brown hair was uncombed, his rough beard darker against a tired face, but his hazel eyes were clear. Mabel had placed another bowl of soup before him, and this time he surrendered without negotiation. "In the teams," Cole said quietly, "loyalty never meant hiding wrong. If a man beside you walks into darkness, you do not turn off the light and call it brotherhood. You pull him back even if he hates you for it." Eve looked down at the tablet in front of her. The files, the maps, the fake invoices, the sedative DART report, the pasture photographs, all of it was real. Still, a frightened part of her remembered Chicago, the closed doors, the cold shoulders, the way truth had made her feel like the guilty one. "And if he does not come back?" she asked. Cole's voice softened. "Then you keep the light on for the next person." That was when Mabel Thorne placed a weathered hand on Eve's shoulder. The older woman's silver hair was pinned in a loose bun, and her blue eyes held the stubborn mercy that had made Bright Hollow a refuge. "Child, some folks call silence peace because they have never been the one trapped under it." A bell rang from the barn, not the sweet wind chime by the porch, but the emergency bell Mabel kept above Bishop's stall. One hard clang, then another. Ash surged to his feet. Eve's chair scraped back. Outside, Bishop's deep, furious snort rolled through the yard like thunder under sunlight. They reached the barn in seconds. Bishop stood in his stall with his chestnut coat darkened by sweat, his old folded ear pinned back, and his front hoof striking the floorboards. The stall door was still latched, but the tack room beside it had been forced open. A man in a gray cap bolted through the rear door, carrying a black satchel. He was lean, sharp-faced, and quick, dressed like a farmhand who had never worked a clean hour in his life. Ash went after him with controlled speed, not wild anger, but trained certainty. Eve followed, drawing her weapon but keeping her voice level. "Federal agent, stop!" The man ran for a black pickup near the service road. Before he reached it, Ash cut across his path and planted himself low, teeth visible, eyes bright as firelight. The man froze. His hands lifted. Eve cuffed him while Mabel stood behind her with a pitchfork she looked entirely prepared to use as legal commentary. Inside the satchel were forged Bright Hollow invoices, a portable drive, and several blank Northgate transport forms. Someone had sent him to recover what Cole had hidden and plant what would make Mabel look guilty. Bishop had heard him in the tack room before any person did. The old horse, grumpy guardian of a sacred little farm, had once again refused to let a lie walk out the door. The drive gave Eve enough to move. By late afternoon, a federal team quietly entered Northgate's lower wing under the authority of an administrative inspection linked to medical safety and unlawful detention concerns. Eve did not go in alone. She went with 2 regional agents, a medical officer, and Ash. The lower wing was not marked on public diagrams. It sat beneath the rehabilitation center behind a locked service corridor, smelling of bleach, damp concrete, and old fear. There they found Walter Boone. Walter was 63, tall but thin from hard months, with a silver beard, tangled gray hair, and hands that trembled until he saw Cole's name on Eve's phone screen. His eyes, though tired, still carried a stubborn blue brightness. He had once been a Navy mechanic, a man who could fix engines by sound and make younger sailors laugh during long nights at sea. Northgate had taken that laughter down to a whisper, but not erased it. When Eve told him Cole had found him, Walter closed his eyes and breathed like a man hearing a hymn from far away. He spoke enough to give a statement. People were being pressured into work under the weight of fees, records, and fear. Transfers were used to make them disappear from one ledger and appear on another. Walter had seen names changed into numbers, then numbers turned into profit. His testimony did not stand alone, and that was what made it strong. Eve now had the micro SD card, the sedative dart, the medical report showing Cole's injuries did not match a horse incident, Mabel's cancellation letter, Noah Bell's body cam copy, Walter's statement, and banking data tying Creed's companies to accounts connected with Judge Harlan Pike. At the courthouse, Pike tried to remain grand. He was a narrow man, with silver hair combed back and rimless glasses resting on a long nose, dressed in a dark robe that made him look like a statue of law, rather than a servant of it. But when Ash stopped beside his leather briefcase and refused to move, Eve requested the search already approved by the warrant. Inside were bed count sheets, payment codes, and transfer approvals matching Creed's records. Pike's face lost its polished calm. For the first time, the man who had sentenced others to accountability looked afraid of the word himself. Then Noah Bell arrived. The young deputy's sandy brown hair was windblown, his uniform neat, but his face pale. He handed Eve a copy of his patrol body cam file. "Voss ordered the ridge cameras off the night Renner was moved," he said. His voice shook, but he did not step back. "I should have spoken sooner." Eve accepted the drive. "You are speaking now." That night in Mabel's kitchen, Eve opened the final drive from the tack room. The screen lit their faces in blue. The video showed Red Alder Yard. Voss stood near a truck, his gray-blonde hair bright under a security lamp, his voice calm as he ordered Cole moved to Bright Hollow. If the FBI kept digging, he said, Mabel would take the fall. Eve looked at Ash, then toward the barn where Bishop stood watch in the dark. This time the wall of silence did not fall because someone shouted. It cracked because a dog listened, an old horse refused to move, and one woman would not look away. At dawn, the federal convoy came over the northern road without sirens. Black SUVs, marked units, medical vans, and evidence trucks moved through Harbor Wren beneath a sky washed clean by pale gold light. The town was still waking. Curtains lifted, porch lights blinked off. Men who had spent years pretending not to see certain things now stood behind windows, watching truth arrive with quiet engines and sealed warrants. Eve Marrow sat in the lead vehicle with Ash beside her, the 5-year-old German shepherd upright and silent, his sable coat glowing where the early sun touched it. He did not bark. He did not need to. Some mornings did not require noise to announce judgment. Northgate Renewal Facility was sealed before breakfast. Its clean blue sign with its painted hands and hopeful slogan looked suddenly small against the line of federal agents moving through the gates. Judge Harlan Pike was arrested in his private office at the courthouse, still wearing his dark robe, one hand resting on a stack of new transfer orders he would never sign. His silver hair was perfectly combed, his rimless glasses steady on his long nose, but the dignity he had practiced for decades had left his face. Elias Creed, the elegant owner of Northgate, was stopped at a small northern airfield while trying to board a private plane. He wore a charcoal wool coat, polished shoes, and the stunned expression of a man who had spent his life believing money could buy distance from consequence. Sheriff Graham Voss was taken into custody after Deputy Noah Bell gave his sworn statement and surrendered the body cam copy showing the ridge cameras being ordered off. Voss did not fight. He only looked toward Eve with the cold disappointment of a man offended that a woman and her dog had ruined his version of order. By noon, agents had frozen accounts tied to Creed's shell companies. Federal investigators began sorting through contracts, bed count sheets, transport orders, forged invoices, and payment trails. Walter Boone, thin and silver-bearded, but standing straighter than he had in months, gave his first formal testimony with Cole Renner sitting nearby. Walter's hands trembled around a paper cup of coffee, but his blue eyes stayed clear. He spoke not like a broken man, but like one who had walked out of a cellar carrying a lantern for others. Northgate was over. The machine that had counted people as profit had finally been forced to count its own sins. But evil, when cornered, sometimes reaches for one last match. That afternoon, Bright Hollow looked almost peaceful. Mabel Thorne stood in the tack room with Eve, sorting the last of Bishop's old gear and the remaining evidence logs. Mabel's small frame seemed tired beneath her brown barn coat, but her silver hair was pinned firmly, and her blue eyes had not softened toward the men who tried to bury her farm under false papers. Cole, still moving carefully, repaired a loose hinge near the main gate with more determination than grace. He wore a flannel shirt over a medical brace, his rugged face pale but alive. Pickles hovered near a basket of ribbon like a criminal considering a career change. Ash was the first to hear it. The German shepherd's head snapped toward the road. His ears went high. His body became still in that terrible, beautiful way trained dogs do when the world has spoken through sound too far away for people. Then Eve heard it too, the rising growl of an engine moving too fast over gravel. The sound struck the farm before the truck appeared, tires tearing over the road, loose stones snapping against the fence, a deep metallic roar rolling toward Bright Hollow like a storm with a steering wheel. Bishop screamed from his stall, not in fear, but in recognition. For one breath, the whole farm became a held prayer. A black pickup burst through the outer lane, heading for the main yard. Later, investigators would learn that Creed's last loyal men had been sent to recover a hidden storage box they believed still remained at Bright Hollow, and to frighten Mabel into silence. In that moment, there was no time for explanations. Eve saw the truck, saw Mabel near the tack room, saw Cole too far from her, saw Ash already moving. The truck did not aim directly for anyone at first. It aimed for the yard, for panic, for the last chance to scatter evidence before the federal net closed. Then Bishop made his choice. The old chestnut horse broke the weakened latch of his stall with one heavy thrust. He was not young, one ear folded forever. His knees were stiff from age. His temper had survived more winters than most men's promises. But he came out like an ancient guardian from a stable door, muscles shining under his winter coat, mane flying, hooves striking sparks of frozen mud. He did not charge the truck head-on like some impossible creature from a legend. He ran across the gateway at the exact wrong moment for the driver and the exact right moment for everyone else. The driver jerked the wheel to avoid him. The pickup skidded sideways, clipped the wooden fence, and crashed into a wall of stacked hay bales. The impact shattered rails and threw straw into the air like golden snow. Bishop slipped in the torn mud and went down hard against the broken fence. The truck died with a final cough. Ash reached the driver's door before the man inside could recover. Eve pulled Mabel back behind the water trough, then moved with the calm fury of a woman who had run out of patience for darkness. Cole blocked the passenger side, breathing hard, one hand braced against the truck, his eyes fixed and steady. Within minutes, the men were restrained, the storage box was secure, and Bright Hollow was still standing. Only Bishop did not rise. Mabel reached him first. She dropped to her knees beside his great chest, placing both hands against his neck. "No, old man," she whispered, "do not you dare leave before I finish scolding you." Bishop's brown eyes found her. They were not frightened. They were tired, deep, and strangely peaceful. Ash sat beside him without a sound. Cole knelt slowly and removed the old bridle from the tackroom wall, the cracked leather that had once hidden the micro SD card that saved his life. He laid it gently beside Bishop's neck, not as a tool, but as an honor. Eve stood over them, throat tight, watching the farm's fiercest soul rest under the fading afternoon sun. Bishop did not pass that day. He stayed 3 more mornings, wrapped in blankets near the warm side of the barn, with Mabel sleeping in a chair beside him. Ash visited often, lying close but never crowding. Cole repaired the broken fence quietly, as if every nail were a thank you. Pickles, unable to understand the sacred weight of farewell, stood near the stall, chewing straw with solemn stupidity, until Mabel wiped her eyes and muttered, "Even now, you have to eat like the county pays you by the mouthful." For the first time in days, everyone laughed through tears. On the 4th morning, when dawn opened over Lake Superior in soft rose and silver, Bishop took one slow breath with Mabel's hand resting in his mane. Then he was gone, gentle as a gate closing in the wind. "You are not lost," Mabel whispered. "You are just standing guard on the other side of the fence." Weeks passed. Northgate remained closed. Former residents had their cases reviewed. Walter Boone returned to Bright Hollow to help care for retired service dogs, his hands still shaking but useful again. Noah Bell left Voss's shadow and became a formal cooperating witness. Mabel was publicly cleared. Bright Hollow, once nearly framed as a place of guilt, was recognized as a recovery farm for veterans, aging working dogs, old horses, and people whom the world had counted too cheaply. Eve did not become healed all at once. Healing rarely entered like thunder. It came slowly, like morning over cold water. Chicago was still part of her, but no longer only as a scar. It had become the reason she heard silence differently. Cole stayed through the repairs, helping Mabel rebuild fences and train older dogs to walk beside wounded men. He and Eve did not rush toward grand promises. They stood near each other in the quiet, and sometimes that was more honest than any vow. In spring, Mabel raised a new wooden entrance at the front of the farm. Carved into the beam were 2 words, Bishop's Gate. Horses trotted through it under bright blue sky. Retired K-9s slept in patches of sun near the porch. Pickles ate part of the dedication wreath and caused a dignified minister to lose his place during the blessing. People laughed, and the laughter did not break the moment. It completed it. Eve rested her hand on Ash's head while Cole fastened Bishop's old bridle beside the gate. Mabel stood between them, small and unbent, watching the morning light spill over the fields. "Some souls do not need medals," she said. "They only need a gate, so they can keep watch." Ash stepped beneath Bishop's Gate and looked toward the shining lake. Beyond the fields, Lake Superior opened like a road of light leading home. In the end, this story reminds us that goodness does not always arrive with a loud voice. Sometimes it comes through the quiet courage of a woman who refuses to look away. Sometimes it comes through the faithful eyes of a dog who senses pain before people can explain it. And sometimes it comes through an old horse who stands at the gate, not because anyone ordered him to, but because love has a way of teaching even the gentlest creatures how to be brave. Life often hides its miracles in ordinary places: a country road, a barn door, a tired animal, a stranger who needs help. We may walk past these moments every day without knowing that God has placed a small test of kindness in front of us. Not every miracle opens the sky. Some miracles simply open a heart that had grown tired. Some miracles are found when one soul stops for another and says, "You are not forgotten." Bishop's sacrifice teaches us that love is never wasted. Ash's loyalty teaches us that animals are not just companions. They are gifts, guardians, and living reminders that God's creation carries wisdom we should never ignore. Eve's courage teaches us that doing what is right may cost us comfort, but it can also save lives. Cole's survival teaches us that even when a person feels buried by darkness, grace can still find a way through the fence. In our daily lives, we may not face great crimes or dangerous roads, but we do meet people and animals who need gentleness. A neighbor who feels alone, a veteran who carries silent pain, a stray animal waiting for food, warmth, or a kind hand, a family member who needs forgiveness, a friend who needs someone to listen. Every act of mercy, no matter how small, becomes a light on the road home. So let us live with softer hearts and stronger courage. Let us protect the innocent, speak for those who cannot speak, and treat animals with the care they deserve. They feel fear, loyalty, comfort, and love in ways deeper than many people realize. When we show kindness to them, we honor the Creator who made them. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who believes in loyalty, second chances, and the quiet miracles God still places in our path. Leave a comment and tell us where you are watching from, and tell us about an animal that changed your life. Subscribe to the channel for more stories of courage, faith, and healing. May God bless you, protect your family, comfort your heart, and guide your steps toward kindness every single day.